Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of Exploring Digital Media. Before we actually start class here, if you're seeing this, you're seeing the pre-release on the internet. It means you're watching it live, or you're joining us in Zoom. Zoom audience, can you hear me okay? When you open up your mic and actually say something.
Someone push to talk. Join us.
Hello.
Hello, Scully.
Hi, Scully. How are you?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Good.
And so if you're watching on the internet, you can hear everybody in Zoom, but you can't see everybody. But if you're in Zoom, we can see you. So feel free to unmute your camera and join us, so we can see you as well. So this is all part of a bit of a grand experiment for us where we have some microphones in the classroom. Hopefully it'll make it easier to hear our discussion that goes on in the classroom. We wanted to...
I can't hear you on Zoom, but I see you on YouTube.
You see me... I'm sorry, you said you see me muted, Fidelis?
You can't hear us? Let's see.
Scully, can you hear and see me okay? Stand by. Working out the bugs.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Ooh.
Anybody else on Zoom hear or see me? Yes or no?
I hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can hear you on Zoom.
Great.
Can we drop them in the house now? Drop them in the
I
house.
have audio and video on YouTube, but not on Zoom. So I'm just wondering if
I see.
everyone.
Well, my video on Zoom should not... Hey, Andrew, can you bring down the levels of the Zoom in the house here? It's pretty loud.
They're doing that.
Okay, great. So it looks like most people's videos are muted on Zoom, but hopefully ours is not. Did you check?
No, it is. It's going.
Okay, great. Fidelis, is that cleared up for you? Or are we still muted?
No, we're not muted.
Okay, great. Just a quick heads up before we actually start class as well. The next assignment is posted. We will end class the way that we're doing this kind of soft start now. We'll soft end, answer any questions that are not relevant to the online audience necessarily. But if you're on Zoom, you can join us as well. So any other thoughts from you, Ian?
No, that's it. But I'll be on the chat in Zoom, so if there's any questions that don't make it,
That's
we can talk
That's
that way
okay.
as well.
Great. All right.
Okay.
If the control room is ready, we can dim the lights and let me know when we're ready to start. That's going to be part of it. All right, everybody, welcome back to another week of Exploring Digital Media. This is our second lecture here in the cinema, and this week we're going to be talking about framing, composition, and lens basics. And we'll actually tackle this in the reverse order today. We're going to start with lenses. So let's dive right in. We have two kind of typical types of lenses. We have prime lenses and zoom lenses. And who wants to give me a quick definition? What's the difference? Yeah.
A prime lens is a fixed focal length, and a zoom will have a range from like 70 to 200 in this example.
Okay, yeah, so we have a fixed focal length on one, which means you can't zoom, right? And a zoom lens or a variable focal length lens can zoom, which means you can literally crank a ring on the lens and the image either enlarges or gets farther away, right? All right, great. Prime lenses construction is pretty simple. Inside we have a couple of lens element groups that, when you turn the focus ring, some of them move, bring your image into focus or out of focus. And a zoom lens is a bit more complicated. As we look at this cross section here, you've got a couple different lens groupings that move to either zoom your image in or zoom it out and also change your focus. But I mean, look how complicated this thing is. Look how many lenses we have and how many moving parts there are. It's pretty crazy when you actually look at it. But why might we choose one or the other? Let's talk about some pros and cons. When would you want to have a simple prime lens or a zoom lens? Who's got some use cases for me? And Zoom, feel free to, if you're in the distant audience, feel free to chime in as well. Yeah.
I guess you would use a zoom lens when you want to be able to respond quickly to different.
Okay, so when you want to respond quickly? Okay, so maybe you don't know what's going to happen. You're covering an event and you need the versatility. Yeah, that makes sense. How about an argument for a prime lens? Yeah.
When you want isolate your subject with a shallow depth of field.
Oh, shallow depth of field. Okay, but can you not have a shallow depth of field on a zoom lens?
You can.
Okay.
If you zoom all the way out to 200 and
Okay.
the widest aperture.
So maybe there are some tricks to getting a shallower depth of field with the zoom lens, but maybe it's easier on the prime lens. Is that always the case?
But it
Not
will.
necessarily. So there's something in a zoom lens's construction that might make it easier to have a shallow depth of field, and we're going to talk about more about what that means a little bit next week when we talk about exposure. Anybody have anything else? How about our zoom audience? Somebody give me a benefit of a prime lens over a zoom lens. Just open your mic up and start talking. Yeah,
Say it again, Alex.
go ahead.
I think many prime lenses let in more light, basically.
All right, more light. So prime lenses tend to be faster, right? They actually let more light down the barrel of the lens, which means you get better low light performance, right? Great. Prime lenses are lighter, right? So the physicality of the lens is much smaller, easier to move around. If you're going to carry a camera with you, maybe you're taking a prime lens with you. Exactly, right? So they tend to be cheaper because the construction is simpler. We said faster. I like to put forced creativity here because with the zoom lens, people kind of stand in one place and will just zoom in or out to kind of get the shot that they want. But it really forces you to get creative. Like you have to actually get closer to your subject or farther away. So I think that it's a really handy way as a starting photographer to kind of challenge yourself to build a more complicated frame. They're lighter, there's less to break, so if you have to replace it, right, it's cheaper. And zoom lenses tend to be more expensive. They're slower as far as how much light comes down the barrel of the lens. But you do get that versatility, right? If you're going to cover an event, it's much easier to have a zoom lens so that you can kind of snap in or snap out depending on what's happening with the action. Or even if you don't want to carry a bunch of lenses with you. Let's say you're going up to shoot in nature and you just don't want to carry 3 lenses with you so that you have the options. A zoom lens will kind of give all those to you. All right. So there are kind of 3 categories that we define lenses in, either a wide-angle lens, a normal lens, or a telephoto lens are the 3 typical ways that we define these, the 3 categories of lenses. And so let's first just think about what we see with our human eye, okay? So we have a peripheral vision of about 180 degrees, which is pretty wide. But we can't focus on everything in our peripheral vision at once. The area that we actually can kind of focus on is called your foveal vision, and it's about 40 degrees wide, which is pretty narrow when you think about it. So a camera lens all have different fields of view, and they're typically marked with this marking over here that is something in millimeters. So like the lens on screen here is a 50 millimeter lens, and it has a field of view of 46 degrees. And I have a little asterisk down here that's on a full frame 35 millimeter sensor, and we'll get to what that means in a second. And we measure this diagonally on the image, so diagonally across an image, and I do sneak pictures of my kids into my slides. From corner to corner, we have a 46 degree of view. And that's just kind of interesting. It's not the reason that a normal lens is called, or a 50 millimeter lens is a normal lens on a full frame sensor, but it's just kind of interesting that the degree of view that you see, that you can pay attention to in any detail, is similar to what a normal lens is. But really, like a normal lens kind of defines the spatial relationships between objects, whether things are kind of distorted and pushed farther away, or compressed and on top of each other. A normal lens kind of has the same properties of what your human eye sees. So again, a normal lens on a full frame sensor is about 50 millimeters. We'll just give you a kind of typical spatial relationship between objects that you see down your lens. All right, so a telephoto lens is anything that's kind of zoomed in. And I have pictured here prime lenses, but certainly zoom lenses are telephoto as well. This is an 85 millimeter lens, which has a field of view on a full frame camera of about 28 degrees. So we're really kind of narrowing down our field of view at this point. Whereas the wide angle lens kind of is the opposite, right? So a 35 millimeter will give us about 63 degrees for the field of view. So which you might choose depends on what story you're going to go tell. How much of an area do you need to see? All right, so let's play a little game now. It's kind of a boring little rant about.
Pause for just 1 second. So we just lost the Zoom section.
Okay.
So Scully was asking if we could actually roll back a little bit. They've shared the YouTube link, but they missed a little bit of a section.
Sure.
So if you wouldn't mind rolling back to let's start with here.
Okay.
Should be good. Thank you, Dan.
Are we back up? Are we back up in Zoom? I just don't see it on here.
No, but we're on YouTube right
Now,
Okay.
this is, for some reason, crashed, and I'm troubleshooting. So,
All right.
I
Technical
apologize.
difficulties. We'll try to get Zoom back up. Apologies to those at a distance. All right. So wide, normal, and telephoto lenses are the kind of three types of categories that we kind of categorize lenses as, where a wide-angle lens shows you a wider field of view. A normal lens kind of gives you the approximation of what you see with a human eye, and a telephoto lens is something that's a little bit tighter field of view wise. So we've talked about what categories we have lenses in. Let's now play a game where we can actually look at images and describe what qualities we see in these. So we'll play a little game called wide, normal, and telephoto. All right, and how we play this is I'm going to put up an image, and you're going to tell me, what do you think? Are we looking at a wide angle, a normal, or a telephoto? So someone in the audience here, yes?
Wide.
This is a wide angle lens. Why do you say that?
Because of the distortion with the ducts that are close to the front element of the lens, and you can see a lot of the background as well.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we have a lot of distortion in the lens, right? So what is it that kind of is distorted in this image?
The beak and the duck's head, because that's not how ducks look.
Okay, so this isn't quite how a duck looks, right? This is kind of a wild-looking image, right? And it's kind of the distance in this image that's kind of spread out, right? Like we're elongating the duck's nose because we're so close to it, right? And the distance behind it is really, things kind of spread out and get really far away, even though these ducks aren't that big, right? The trees presumably aren't as far away as they might seem in this image, right? Very good. And so this image is actually a very wide-angle lens. The 35 millimeter equivalent is 7.2 millimeters. So that's a very wide-angle lens. How about this one? Oh crap! I left it up there. Spoiler. Wide, normal, or telephoto. I'll just stand over here. Somebody else. Ian, what do you think?
I don't know. If you look at sort of the width of the road and how it gets smaller, and the background, the difference between proximity and sort of the expansiveness of the space, I'd say it's probably a little bit wider, maybe would be my guess.
Okay. So you are correct. This is another very wide angle lens. The equivalent is 11.9 millimeters. Another road. So similar to what we just looked at, does this one feel different than the wide angle lens we just saw? Anyone? Right? Yes, Dan, it does. It looks quite a bit different, right? So instead of the road being wide up front, as Ian said, and narrowing off very quickly, it's kind of almost the same shape all the way down. And what is further away in the image feels much closer, right? So we're probably looking at or even a telephoto lens in this case. I jumped right over normal lens and went right to telephoto. So this lens has a 135 millimeter lens on it, this image does. So this is actually a telephoto lens. And we're looking at a compression of space, whereas the wide angle lens kind of distorted and exaggerated distance. A telephoto lens does the opposite, it compresses space. How about this one? What do we think? Kareem?
Feels wide.
Feels wide? What do you say?
The trees at the back seem to be very far away, like they should be.
Yeah, so distance again is a bit more exaggerated here, right? We are looking at a landscape that presumably has distance in it, but what is close feels kind of exaggerated compared to what is far away, right? You are correct. This is a 28 millimeter lens, so this is a wide angle lens as well in this case. Just a couple more here. How about this? We've got some interesting things happening here. We've got some sharp elements and some blurred elements, but that has nothing to do with our lens itself. Do we think this is wide, normal, or telephoto? Say it again?
Almost normal, I would say.
Almost normal. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's slightly wide, but almost normal. Much closer than the last one, right? So 35 millimeters. How about this one?
Telephoto lens.
A telephoto lens, and give me the Y, and we keep looking at the same images, but.
Because everything looks a little bit compressed, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. It's that compression of space, right? How far away is the mountain from Seattle here?
Yeah.
Right? It could almost be right in the city. It's kind of hard to tell. Whereas if we look, so again, 135 millimeter lens, so a telephoto lens. If we look at the same thing, right? So in the previous image that we just looked at, this is the Space Needle in Seattle, right? On this slide here, this image is taken from the Space Needle, right? So we're even closer than the last image was, yet the mountain feels so much farther away, right? And we see a lot more distance and space kind of exaggerated in the city here. So, seeing the difference? And this is a 8 millimeter lens almost. How about this one? This one's interesting. We see a lot in this one, right? We've got, a whole bunch of mountains in the background. But is it a wide-angle lens?
I'm going normal.
You're going normal?
Yeah.
Anybody want to argue counter? 70 millimeter, so just telephoto of normal. But this is to show that you don't have, like a telephoto lens or a longer lens doesn't have to be for a tight shot every time, right? You can use a telephoto lens for a wider shot. You just have to back up. All right, and this feels different than that wide-angle lens, right? The space is more compressed. Like you mentioned something called depth of field, right? How much is in focus, how much is out of focus? It's a little easier to do on a lens that's longer. Yeah. This one.
Did you include any panoramas or like any trick photos or no?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I'm not falling any punches today. Trying to throw a couple tricks in, but nothing like that.
Wide?
A wide? Why do you say wide?
Because it's kind of like getting one to see a lot of the shot.
Yeah, you can see a lot of this shot. You can see, the mountains in the background. But look specifically at like the relationship between the buildings in front and the background elements here of the mountain. Is there a lot of separation between them? Not too much, right? Like we've kind of compressed everything right up against. Like you can't tell if this mountain is, I'm going to exaggerate distance here, 5 miles or 10 miles, right? Whereas if it was a wide-angle lens, I think that we would actually see much bigger spread of distance here. Like the little town that we're looking at is almost like a flat plane, even though we know that the buildings have space. So this is actually a telephoto lens. It's a 300 millimeter lens.
And I think in all your examples, we've seen sort of a loss of the middle ground, or the foreground elements are always all sort of there very prominently, and the background objects sort of get compressed and to be almost relatively as prominent, and that middle ground that we're used to seeing is sort of disappears. And it's almost as if you take a piece of paper and you fold it and bring them closer together in some ways, right?
Yeah. All right. So this is our last image in this little game that we're playing. I know everybody's having a great time. Wide, normal, or telephoto? What do you think, Scully?
I think it's a telephoto.
All right, why? Give me the why.
Because the trees, the distance between the trees is very condensed, and the size of the people in comparison to the trees is, I would say they are relatively small physically compared to the trees, but they're all similar on similar planes.
Cool. Anybody want to argue counter?
There hasn't been one normal one this whole time. And I want to go normal now.
It's
Nope.
actually, this is a wide-angle lens, right?
I can't do this.
It's a little bit of a trick, and I think part of what confuses it is the mist that's in the background, because it does have the flattening effect. But if you look at the size of the trees and how kind of cavernous it is before we get to these people, it's a tricky one. It's definitely not a straightforward one. All right. So yeah, we talked about the wide lens as well, and I keep saying the equivalency or on a 35 millimeter sensor. This is something that's an important distinction. And so what we're talking about is the actual sensor size in your camera that's going to affect like what a 35 millimeter lens looks like. So digital cameras have a whole bunch of different sensor sizes, and you need to look up your specifications to see what size is in your camera. But the two typical ones that we see these days in most kind of consumer and prosumer cameras are the APS-C size lenses, which Canon and Nikon have very similar sizes, as well as the full frame 35 millimeter sensor, this blue line here. And what is the actual impact on our images when we put a lens on our camera? Let's take a look, right? So if this is our image circle that our lens projects, and we put the same lens on both cameras, the red box is going to be what the full frame sensor is going to see, and the blue frame is going to be what the APS-C or the smaller sensor sees. And so the effect is that if you put a 50 millimeter lens, which you might have heard is like a normal lens, on a 35 millimeter sensor, is not going to be the same when you put it onto an APS-C size sensor, because it's actually going to have the effect of cropping in and feeling more like a telephoto lens, or it will be a more telephoto lens. So if we kind of take these comparisons side by side, you're going to see on the left here that you actually get a whole lot more image out of the same image. You get a lot more space out of the same lens, and on the right side, you're a bit more cropped in. So this is just to say, just because a lens says 50 millimeters or 30 millimeters, it doesn't mean that it is categorically a wide or a normal or a telephoto lens. It depends on the camera that you put it on. So to give you a sense of what kind of fields of view you get, on a full frame sensor, 14 millimeters is about one of the wider lenses that you're going to find, and you can work your way in. That's going to give you about 114 degrees of field of view, right? 24 is going to give you about 84 degrees. 35 millimeter, this purple here, is going to give you 63 degrees field of view, and we can work our way in. But it's interesting to compare this directly against the APS-C size sensor. So on an APS-C size sensor, right, so all these down here, these degrees, are about the same. The exact equivalent doesn't exist. But you need to put these size lenses on to get the same fields of view. So it's just an interesting thing to consider. Like when you pick up a lens, like a 35 millimeter lens is not always the same depending on your camera system. I just want to hammer that home.
Well, to be clear, the lens is always the same, just the angle of view is what changes, right? So that there's sort of a relativity of how a lens might act based off of the hardware, the camera that you attach to it, okay? If that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so why is it that all lenses are marked in millimeters if that's not a constant between cameras, right? And it's because of how the distance inside of the lens from where that goes to the actual sensor plane or film plane, depending on your camera system. But it's just important to know that if you're using APS-C, we talk about the crop factor or the equivalency. So usually if we talk about lenses, we bring it back, the equivalency, to the 35 millimeter sensor. And so to convert an APS-C magnification, we need to multiply by 1.6x or so. So that means that a 30 millimeter lens is going to turn into a 48 millimeter lens. And the range of a normal lens is about 45, 50 millimeters to 60, 70. It varies a little bit. And then a 60 millimeter lens, like the lens on the right here, is going to be multiplied, and it's going to be the equivalent of a 96 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter sensor. Hopefully this is making sense. We're going to pick apart what some of these markings on the lenses mean. So this is a zoom lens. You can see that on this ring here, it goes from 18 millimeters to 85 millimeters. 135 millimeters. It's a little bit pixelated on this screen. But this is a lens that's made to go on an APS-C lens. And so that means that the equivalent, when we do the math, is a 28 millimeter lens to a 216 equivalent, not actual lens, the equivalency. So, is that making sense, Ian? I feel like I'm confusing myself here.
I think the thing is that sort of focal length for any given lens is defined by where the position of the glass elements are, and it doesn't change from lens to lens. So a 35 millimeter lens is always a 35 millimeter lens. Okay, but whether that lens acts as sort of a wide angle lens or a telephoto lens or a normal lens, and sort of has the visual artifacts that we were just looking at when we were analyzing those images depends on the camera body that that lens is attached to. So in some ways, when we talk about crop factor, what we're just saying is that if you use this lens on a 35 millimeter camera body, it'll be sort of normal. But if you put it on APS-C, it actually gets a little bit more telephoto. And so the artifacts that we noticed in the telephoto images will sort of crop up in those images a little bit. But so at the end of the day, because there's so much variability in the size of sensors and the types of lenses, that we have through pretty much just colloquially settled on 35 millimeter full frames as sort of our moment of reference. So you'll hear a lot of people say that a 50 millimeter is a normal lens. And that is true on a 35 millimeter camera. And so that's why they're sort of colloquially saying that that's a normal lens. But it's not entirely true, because you could make that lens look telephoto, and you even, with a bigger sensor, could make that lens look more wide angle. It's just that conventionally, it's much easier to talk about these things in reference to one specific sensor size. And so because of the prevalence of 35 millimeter film over the sort of the history of photography, we've settled on the 35 millimeter full frame size. Okay? And so I think what we're trying to illustrate is that the lenses have a specific focal length, and that there are visual artifacts based off of whether those lenses are acting as wide, normal, or telephoto lenses, and that the body that you attach to that lens matters. And so there's this relationship between the size of the sensor and the lens that will be important for you understanding whether this lens acts as a telephoto or acts as a normal. Okay, so it's just something to be aware of. And for the most part, when you buy, say, an APS-C camera, you're going to get a kit lens that maybe goes from 14 to 60. But when you buy a 35 millimeter camera with a kit lens, maybe it goes from 24 to 85. So the manufacturers are aware of this relationship, and so the lenses that you get with any specific camera body are usually designed to be the range that you will find most useful. A little bit wide, some normal, and a little bit telephoto. Okay? But just do be aware that when you mix and match bodies and lenses, that you can get some of these weird effects where a lens actually appears more telephoto than maybe you might be expecting.
Great, perfectly distilled, thank you. All right, so let's just look at some of the other markings on this lens since we're talking about lenses today. So here we have a Canon zoom lens. We have this EFS, and that's Canon-specific nomenclature for this is a APS-C lens. It's made to go on our smaller sensor size. This is the focal length of the lens. It's 10 to 18 millimeters. And then we've got this ratio here, 1 to 4.5 to 5.6. Does anybody know what that means? This is a little bit of a teaser for next time. Yes.
Aperture?
It's the aperture, right? And what is the aperture?
The hole in the lens?
Sure, it's that opening that kind of opens and closes and controls how much light comes down the barrel of the lens. Yeah, and do you know why we have two different markings on it?
Yeah, because it's a zoom, so its widest is at 4.5, and when it's zoomed all the way in, it's at 5.6. I've never understood that one in the colon.
The one is just the ratio.
Okay.
So yeah, so what we're saying here is the zoom. What is your name again?
Ralph.
Ralph. So Ralph is saying our widest aperture on this lens when we're all the way zoomed out is 4.5, and when you zoom in, you can't get that wide anymore. Your maximum aperture, the widest it can be, is 5.6. And we'll get to what those numbers mean when we talk about exposure, but just know that this means that the aperture is actually variable as well, and you don't have a ton of control when you're zoomed in because that is the widest it can be. IS, anybody know what this stands for? And this is different depending on camera brand. Yes, Connor?
Image stabilization.
Image stabilization, so this lens has image stabilization in it, and STM is simply the model of lens that this is. So Canon has the STM series, they have the L series, where the L series is kind of their top tier. The STM is the step below, but a lot cheaper, and so you might get a very similar lens with slightly different construction. All right, and so the equivalent, if we talk about the equivalency, is 16 millimeter to 28 millimeter on this lens for a full frame sensor. All right, and just to reiterate, if you were to take a APS-C lens and put it on a full frame camera, right, this is what's going to happen. You're going to actually vignette the edges of your frame. If your red frame is the full frame sensor. So you need to be careful that you buy the right lens for your camera, because otherwise this could happen to you, or maybe the lens doesn't even fit. That's the other thing that could happen to you. So just be aware when you buy.
So it works better in one of the directions than the other. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if you have a lens designed for a full frame camera, right, as long as the lens mount and the flange depth, which is the sort of distance of that mount to the sensor, work for that camera body, it has enough coverage, right? This circle that we have projected here is the lens projection. It's called coverage. It has enough coverage to always cover a smaller sensor. But it doesn't go the other way. Or it often doesn't go the other way. Because if you think about it, there's sort of an economic reason why you might have a small, like a lens with less coverage. It has less glass in it. It's less materials, so it's cheaper. It ends up being smaller. And if that will work for a camera with a smaller sensor size. But if all of a sudden you put that on a camera with a larger sensor size, then you end up with this vignetting around the edges. And I think maybe we've all seen this in sort of old pictures where you get that sort of darkness on the edges, and you get makes more of a circular oval. Right?
Yeah. And so if you're investing in camera hardware, you might be like, oh, I'm going to not spend much money on a camera body, but I'm going to spend a lot of money on the lens. This is what might happen to you, or in reverse. Like you might actually, you might buy a coverage that gives you all of this coverage, but you're really only using the center of that lens at any given time. So if you're buying a camera with a smaller sensor, like Ian just described, it might make more sense to buy the lens that has the circle that's a closer approximation to your sensor just because it's cheaper. And when you upgrade camera systems, at that point you consider, do I upgrade my lenses as well? All right, another zoom lens, same markings. We've got our EF series, that's Canon's mount. We've got the zoom range. We've got the aperture. This one is not variable, right? So this is a zoom lens, but the aperture is fixed at 2.8, which means that the aperture, even if you zoom all the way in, doesn't shift. It's always going to be 2.8. And again, we're going to talk about what 2.8 means next time. This little mark down here just tells you the diameter of the lens. So if you're going to buy a filter for it, that's the size filter you need to buy. That's not actually like the focal length of the lens. All right, and this is an EF lens, so like we just talked about, you don't want to put this onto, or if you put this onto an APS-C sensor, it's going to crop in. All right, so now let's see what this does relationally. So this is specifically looking at our subject and background. So where is this guy? Do we know? Not exactly. Okay, what do we see? Do we see something in the background? Take a guess. Where is he? A street, okay. We get a little bit wider, and so the size of our subject is the same. This is roughly a medium shot or a medium close-up, right? That hasn't changed, but what we see has changed, right? And even how he looks has changed a little bit. And so what we've done is we've gone from they're down here in the corner. We've gone from a 280 millimeter to 100 millimeters, all right? And so we can see a little bit more of what's going on here. Keep coming out. We're starting to see a lot more information the farther out we come, right? So we're down to a 50 millimeter lens or a normal lens. So we're out of the telephoto range. He looks pretty normal still, but we can now see he's kind of in like an alley. We see some cars, right? Coming out even wider. Now the cars are even getting farther away. So this is interesting. What's actually happening for the photographer here to keep the shot the same as we change our zoom? Ralph?
You have to get closer.
Okay, yeah, so when we were back at 280 millimeters, if I was shooting Ian, I was probably like some number of feet away, and as I zoom out, or change my focal length to be farther out, then I'm walking in closer to get the same shot, right? But what's happening to the background is really interesting as we do that. And here we go, we're down at 25 millimeters now, starting to really get a little bit distorted, would you say? Right, we're getting that exaggeration that we saw with the ducks, right? Is it flattering on a human being? No, I'm getting a head shake down here. Anybody in the back? No. And we get all the way. This is the widest we went. This is a 16 millimeter lens on a 16 millimeter, or on a 35 millimeter sensor. So the equivalence is 16 millimeters. And you can almost no longer see those cars that we saw initially, right? They were the biggest things in the frame, and now they're completely covered by him. So, but he looks very different, right? So, very interesting trade-off that we're making here. The human body, it's the same thing. Things tend to be more flattering at longer lenses. And so at this lens here, where we're at 400 millimeters, it's the same thing, right? She's right in front of the storefront as far as we can tell. There's no sense of space. We don't know how much depth there is, how far away she is from the store. Whereas if we move all the way down to the spectrum to 24 millimeters, you're almost wondering, where is that painted monkey storefront, right? It's actually behind her because we feel like she's miles away from it now. So the relationship between your subject and the background partly depend on distance, but also depend on what lens you have on the camera, whether it's wide, normal, or telephoto. Specifically looking at the human face, 16 millimeters versus 280 millimeters. Like if you were getting your photo taken, let's say for work for a company page, like which lens would you want to be photographed with? I'm sorry, say a little louder.
85.
85? Okay. So down here, what happens as we kind of come up here? Is there a big difference between these as we go way up? Not really, right? You know, we're getting to the point where it's almost like his face is kind of shrinking inward a little bit, which is interesting. But the biggest difference you'll notice, just like we saw in the alleyway, is it's actually the background that changes the most drastically. And once we get past, roughly here, it's the background that changes most drastically. You can see just how much bigger that background gets each time. But this isn't very flattering, right? We wouldn't want to have our portraits taken with a wide-angle lens for how much distortion it adds and how much it elongates your face.
But conversely, if you do have, say, a character in a situation where you want them to appear slightly unsettling or unnerving, choosing a wider angle lens to sort of increase the distortion on the facial features might be very effective. And this happens often in sort of suspenseful moments in films or horror films or some sci-fi films where they'll use the lensing to distort the features a little bit so that it just feels a little bit off. Right? And you can imagine in a conversation back and forth, if you shot me like tight with a wide-angle lens and my features were really distorted, and you shot Dan from a little further away with an 85mm and he looked like really handsome, there would be this interesting flip-flop as we talked back and forth and a difference in the way we were looking. And so you could use that to your advantage to set up some kind of relationship between us in some ways, right? So all of these things, even though conventionally we might say, oh, we want to take a beautiful portrait of someone, we're going to use sort of an 85, maybe a 100mm lens, don't shy away from using the artifacts of these lenses to do something a little bit stranger, right?
And I think the key there is like a little bit, right? It's not a binary thing where you're either using 16 or 280, right? You've got everything in between. So if you want to make somebody feel off just a little bit, even getting close with a 24mm lens or even a 35 is going to just add a little bit of distortion. So something to consider. The same goes for video. This is a video clip. We've got Scully here in this video clip, but this kind of shows the relationship between two people with different lenses. And Ian showed 2 frames for this, but this has the range in between as well. So let's just take a look at this. So these two characters on a 15mm lens. Right here's 35. Watch the size of them relative to each other as we go in here. $50mm. $75. $100. $150. Right, whereas Scully was very large in frame before, who's becoming the dominant person in the frame now? I mean, all the attention is on Dan, the gentleman on the right. So 260mm, I think this was the farthest in we went. But I always think it's funny to do this, right? Because you don't really notice it as it's a progression over time. But when you just whip back and do the A to B comparison, like, where are they? Now you can tell, you get a sense of the space that they're in. And then, bam, all the way to the other side, right? Very, very different relationship between the two people, and very, different message that you're sending between these 2 frames. So that takes us to this clip from Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is a movie from 1981, where this was used, lens compression was used to the advantage here. So let's watch this clip. High drama, they're right behind him. What happened? They were right behind him. Right. So someone describe for me, what did we just see, like in the first clip, in the first shot that we saw? Lens compression. I see Ralph is making the hand motion, but lens compression, right? We're shooting on a telephoto lens, which compresses space, and we can't tell how far away they are. And then we jump to this shot, what does this do for us? It's an interesting choice. but it kind of takes you out of the moment, right? This kind of element of they're right behind him goes away, and now like
it gives him a chance to escape.
It gives him a chance to escape, right? So it might give us as the audience some breathing room, but also it kind of ratchets down this tension that's been building. So I think it's just an interesting choice to look at. All right, so we keep like looking at different shot sizes. So let's start to talk about the way that we describe shots, and this is particularly relevant to video. And the reason we do this, we kind of categorize shot sizes, is to keep everybody on the same page. So when I say, hey, I want to go get a wide shot or a medium shot, the rest of the people on the crew who are shooting with me know exactly what kind of shot we're going to get. So we kind of standardized our language for this. So we have the extreme wide shot, which this is an example of. It's abbreviated either EWS or XWS, and these are just, if you're making a shot list or making notes to yourself, you might just abbreviate. But what is it that we get from an extreme wide shot? A very big sense of scale, right? You get a sense of place. If you're establishing a location, this might be a shot that you choose because you get so much information in the frame, right? And we'll kind of work our way in here. So a wide shot, also handy to kind of establish a scene. You get a lot of information out of it. You get more detail, right? And this is kind of the theme of working your way in tighter, is you start to see more details, but you might lose kind of the sense of scale or the overall sense of place. Right? You guys know the wide shot. We've seen this one before, right? Hopefully this was a fun assignment for you. And like I said, just because you have a wide shot doesn't mean that you're on a wide angle lens. So we can look at a very similar shot, right? But on this frame here, this is, I believe, a normal lens or a slightly telephoto lens. And this one is a wide angle lens. They're roughly the same, right? This one's a little bit wider, but the two frames feel very different. So which you might choose, it totally depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell or what you're trying to say, or if you want things to feel weird. What's the other difference in this besides the previous one?
Carpet is distorted.
Yeah, it's distorted, the carpet? Yeah, and why do we notice the carpet more? Where's the camera that does that? Down low, yeah, so the camera's almost on the ground in this one, right? And with a wide lens, it kind of exaggerates their height. They feel taller. All the lines get kind of distorted up top, and we see more of the carpet.
Well, it also becomes a little bit more about the environment that they're in, whereas the previous shot was a lot about sort of their relationship together. And this, in some ways, feels a little bit more about their experience in this larger space. And so you can think about using this for narrative intent too. If you have some kind of story that is about, say, it's the opening of a new building, then maybe you're going to use a wide-angle lens to sort of show the expansiveness of the building while you're interviewing the director of that building or something. Or conversely, if you have a story that's maybe just two people who are in a relationship or something, and the environment doesn't matter, then maybe you'll choose something that really focuses in on them and feels much more contained and confined. Okay.
All right, continuing to work our way in, here's a full shot, and this is typically somebody's body from head to toe without cutting them off. And it's the same thing, like you can have multiple people in a full shot, but the idea is that it's about the height of a person, and depending on the width of your frame, you'll get all the information around them. All right, so here's 3 people, and we've even got someone's shoulder cut off at the edge of the frame here. All right, medium wide shot. So now we're above the ankle. We're kind of below the waist still, and this is working our way in. Another medium wide shot, right? So it's a little bit looser than the waist. Good shot to put multiple people together on if you're trying to give, a full sense of people and the relationship between them. Medium shot. This one is pretty much at the waist to just above the head. Right? And it doesn't matter the width of your frame. You could have a square frame or a 16 by 9 frame, and it's the same amount of space, right? It's still at the waist to just over the head. That is what makes up a medium shot. Medium close up, right? We're starting to lose, in particular, the background, right? And we know we can cheat this by using a different lens. If we used a wider angle lens, we might see more of the background. But we're starting to really focus on our character at this point. It's becoming very clearly about them or an item or whatever's in your frame. Right? Close up, we're now starting to possibly cut off the top of the head. We're just below the chin, typically. And so this is where you get a lot more detail, right? We're starting to see a lot more of the eyes and get the expression and the emotional state of the character. And then we have extreme close-up. This is kind of the opposite of our extreme wide shot, right? This is just a piece of something. And oftentimes it's used to kind of reveal a different detail, right? You might see what's in what somebody's looking at, or you might get a sense of like how they're feeling because of how their eyes are moving. There's lots of different reasons to use this, and it doesn't have to be of a person. Like we usually talk about shot sizes in relation to people, but you can have a extreme close-up of an object where you only see a piece of it.
Right, and think about sort of the Hitchcock rule that Dan alluded to a couple weeks ago, where the larger an object, the more important it is, and much of our job as editors is and directors and filmmakers is focusing attention. So the extreme close-up is really useful if there's some sort of item that you really want to draw the audience's attention to, and you'll see that a lot. The close-up on the briefcase or something like that.
Yeah.
What focal length would you reach for when you want to frame a shot on someone's face, for instance?
So what focal length would you want if you wanted to get a shot of someone's face? It kind of depends on what you want to tell. Like we've seen that you can use a wide angle lens and get very close to somebody and have an extreme close-up, but the effect is that you're going to really distort their face and elongate it, and you're going to get a wide area of the background. Whereas if you want to focus on them, you might reach for a telephoto lens where you kind of compress the background, throw it in soft focus and not really notice what's there, but really focus on the person themselves. So it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. All right, quick quiz. You guys have been sitting here letting us do all the talking up here. So let's play this game. What shot size is this? Max. I heard close-up. No, not focal length, Max. What shot size, right? So this is a close-up, exactly, right? So we're chopping off just the top of the head. We're just below the chin. How about this?
XWS.
XWS, possibly. Maybe just a wide shot.
Maybe.
Right. It's kind of in between. We don't have like a full sense of where we are necessarily, but yeah, wide shot. And these, we're going to differ on exactly what our definitions are too. It's not a hard and fast rule. These are just guidelines as filmmakers that we can communicate with each other quickly. I say, hey, go set up the camera and give me a wide shot, right? I'm expecting something along the lines of this. Whereas if I said, give me an extreme close-up, you're going to reach for a different lens probably. You're going to put the camera in a different position. So it's all about just kind of fluidity of working quickly together, or visualizing your shots. You might make a shot list and say, I want to go from the medium shot to the close-up shot to the extreme close-up, and everybody knows what that progression looks like as you're talking about it, even if you don't know exactly what the frame is going to look like. This one? Medium close-up, very good. Yeah, so we're above the waist by quite a bit. We're at the chest, just over the head. Somebody new. How about someone from the internet? What's this one? Just unmute yourself and let me know. Oh man, we got crickets on the internet tonight. Kareem, what's this?
I'm seeing, sorry. I'm seeing medium wide shot from Jacqueline.
Medium wide shot, Scully, I like it. That's what it is,
well,
right?
I'm saying from Jacqueline.
Okay, great. You're relaying from Jocelyn. So yes, this is a medium wide shot. So we're cutting off the feet a little bit. And this could be a little bit tighter. I like this shot because they also call it the cowboy. And the idea is you can see the guns get pulled, right? So the cowboy shot from the holsters.
Also seeing a full shot.
It was close to a full shot, right? Full shot would
okay.
Traditionally be feet to head. We were cutting off the feet a little bit in the previous frame. How about this one? Medium shot. Yep, right at the waist, right? Extreme close-up. This one's obvious, right? But again, we're seeing what's being reflected in the eye more so than what we're seeing. Well, I guess we're seeing the eye, but a good chance to kind of see what is being seen. In this case, a big white card in the lens. So, and yeah, that's true. This one? Full shot. Yep, head to toe. Very good. Another, well, don't get confused by like what lens we use, right? This is all scale of the person, or size of the person. I'm sorry, you're saying?
Medium close-up?
Medium close-up, yeah.
Okay.
How about this one?
Wide. Medium wide.
Medium wide, why?
The bezel.
This is, but we're not talking about the lens, we're talking about the shot size, right? So these are both medium close-ups, right? From the chest to top of head, right? from the chest to top of head, it's the same shot, but because we've added this element of a wide lens, they feel very different, right? So much more important is all the elements that make up your frame than just what shot size is it, right, when you're talking about intention. All right, so we're almost an hour into our lecture here. We're next going to go into what is composition, but I think this might actually be a good point to take a quick 5-minute break, use the bathroom, work out any online audio issues we're having, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Is it something that you just want to say privately, or?
Well, because of our technical difficulties, I lost some of crucial parts of the lecture and was completely lost about focal length.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, I guess I can just go back and watch the video. I didn't have any idea.
Is it Lorna?
Whether I was looking at a wide shot, or wide lens, or a telephoto lens, or a normal lens. I just was completely lost.
Okay.
Zoom,
Okay.
can
So
you hear us?
when he was going through the images, kind of being
Yeah.
able to. Okay. It also is a bit hard to look at them from the screen inside the other screen inside the other screen. So, I think more generally, it's just being able to look at some of the artifacting that happens with the wide lens. There's sort of some distortion and expansion of space that you may be able to see and perceive through, objects in the frame in your foreground, middle ground, background. And then in a normal range, as they were trying,
I'm sorry, Ian wrote Scully in all letters, capital letters, to indicate that we're being broadcast around the room, I think.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear us actually, Scully?
Yeah. Can you bring our mics up?
And now I can.
You can't hear us?
Okay. Oh, that's okay. So we can definitely hear you in the room. So just be aware of that. But it's totally fine if you want to ask a couple questions about this and sort of talk offline. That's totally fine. But I just wanted to let you know that we actually can hear you in the room. So it's not sort of a private conversation anymore.
Yeah. And was that Lorna asking?
Yeah, that's me. We had when the Zoom went out and we went between YouTube and Zoom, there were different, they were not at the same point. And so I ended up missing some crucial explanation and I just got totally lost.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's our first time running it here. So, everything is recorded and you can go back even now and rewatch it on YouTube. But if you feel like you missed any explanation that you didn't get from rewatching, certainly get in touch. We'd be happy to set up a quick meeting with you and run through the same part of the deck.
That's okay. Thanks, Scully. You were doing a pretty good job explaining it at this point. We're not being recorded though at this point, right? So the recording is off.
Yeah, this will not end up in that.
I'm recording the session but it's not streaming through YouTube.
So you were saying, so the wide angle.
inside the photograph between elements.
All right, sorry to interrupt what's going on online here. I just want to come back real quick. So welcome back to the lecture. There was some confusion about some of the stuff that we talked about in the first half of the lecture, and I just want to address focal length real quick. So focal length is a measurement in the lens that describes like how the distance in the lens itself, but that's kind of irrelevant. And even the millimeters that we're talking about is kind of irrelevant, because what you really need to do is put the lens on the camera and look through it, because that'll give you a sense of, is the lens have a wide field of view, a normal field of view, or a telephoto field of view. So like, are you seeing a lot of information? Is there distortion? Is the kind of space exaggerated? Or is it normal? Like, is the spatial relationship similar to what we see with the human eye? Like, or do people overlap in the same way? Or is it telephoto where space is compressed and we can no longer see what it is that, or how far apart things are? It's kind of like Ian described earlier. Like, it's like taking a piece of paper, right, and folding it in half. Like, you can kind of move the distance back and forth, and you can't tell because it's flat. It's two flat planes that are kind of compressed together. So that's all we're really talking about. If you take nothing else away, just know that we kind of describe focal length in these three broad categories of wide, normal, and telephoto. And what you really need to do is look down, put the lens on your camera, and look down it to see which you're actually looking at. So, and the characteristics being expansion of space, compression of space, or somewhere in between. Does that make sense? All right. So on to composition. And so I love this quote. I just think it's a really good summation of what it is that we're doing. So composition selects and emphasizes elements such as size, shape, order, dominance, hierarchy, pattern, resonance, and discordance in ways that give meaning to things beyond, ways that give meaning to the things beyond photographed, things beyond being photographed, that goes beyond the simple. This is really the key moment here. Forget my bumble there. Beyond the simple, here they are, right? So this is showing an image with intention, showing your subject with intention, and making decisions about why you're putting it out there. So that's what we're doing with composition, is we are going beyond, hey, I took a snapshot, doesn't this look cool? And we're saying, I'm intentionally showing you this image this way. All right? And so in our normal daily life, we see things in 3 dimensions, right? Things have an X and a Y and a Z axis, but we need to overcome this in a frame, because the still image is typically still just 2 dimensions, and we need to kind of overcome this by adding elements that give us depth. That's a lot of what creating depth is all about. And there are some tricks to this. So for one, we create depth by having things in the foreground, right? That's the things that are kind of in front of your subject. We have the middle ground of our image, which typically is the subject. And then we have the background as well. And we kind of think about these 3 things separately as 3 different kind of planes in our image, and how far away your foreground is from your middle ground to your background kind of depends on your lens choice and how you put your image together. But we'll talk about foreground, middle ground, and background elements as we create depth in an image. All right, so here's an image, right? We've got some foreground elements kind of leading us into this image. We've got our subject in the middle ground, and then our background falls nicely out of focus, really kind of highlighting my son here. The handsome young man, thank you. Putting these elements together to kind of build a strong frame. And there are some basic design elements that go back to your art history days that we use to kind of put our frame together. And these are line, shape, form, pattern, texture, and color. There are others as well, but these are the ones that we're going to focus on. So let's look at line. So lines are typically, straight elements. They can also be curved, but they really guide your eye through a frame. They give you an entry point or an exit point sometimes, and they will move you around the frame depending on what direction they're going in, how thick they are. They'll give you flow, but this is all to kind of give you a sense of what you're looking at and how you should look at it. So let's look at an image that has a strong line in it. So let's plainly, what is this? What are we looking at? A staircase. But it's not how you would typically look at a staircase, which is really interesting, right? We're looking straight up at it. And where does your eye enter the frame and where does your eye exit the frame?
Top right.
Right to center.
Top right, okay. So, I'm hearing a couple things. Some people say they go right to the center. My eye kind of follows this line right in and kind of spirals up into the center here. So, but it's a very strong thing that we see here that kind of moves us through the frame, right? So, a nice curved line.
Besides the linear elements that guide our eye to the center of the frame?
Light?
Yeah, so it's a play between light and dark, absolutely. Right, so our eye is attracted to the brightest parts of the images often.
Yeah. All right, and we'll put the metadata on the side here just so that we can have reference for it, but we don't need to talk about it specifically. How about this one? How would you describe this frame? Right, it's much more abstract than what we just looked at. Well, maybe not. It's a very abstract frame, right? We're not exactly sure what it is we're looking at. We can presume that it's windows of a building and some.
I would say it's very busy.
It's very busy, okay? Maybe strong, right? A lot of vertical lines, especially when they're straight, can make a frame feel much stronger. How about where do your eyes enter and exit this frame?
Converges at the center pillar.
It converges at the center, right? All these lines kind of converge and you're naturally kind of following them in, right? And so maybe if you wanted to highlight what it is at the center, I don't know if in this case this is not particularly attractive or nice, but you definitely drive your viewer's eyes into the middle by using these lines to move them around, right? How about this one? There's a lot of lines in this one. This is a frame from Shutter Island, which is a movie. What do you feel when you see this frame? Trapped. Enclosed, right? Pinned in. Yeah?
Ambiguity.
Say it a little louder.
Mystery.
Okay, yeah. Right, part of that's shadow, right? We don't know, there's no light on these subjects. We don't know what they're meeting about. But all these lines kind of add to this element of mystery. Right, and so this also is an easy way visually to communicate to the viewer. This is a video clip from Shutter Island as well, and let's take a quick look at this.
Show your badges, gentlemen.
Right, so there's a lot of very straight and rigid elements to that, a lot of strong vertical lines. Right, even when we come inside here, right, we think about where we could have put the camera to get the shot of everybody entering. Right, we put it up above the walkway where we see this guard walking down with this strong line coming through the frame, and even where the desk is, where they're talking and checking in, is like segmented off in its little corner of the frame. Right, it feels very different than if we had put the camera down on the ground level and just showed the desk. We would have lost a lot of the kind of mystery and intrigue and kind of feeling of being penned in that this image offers us, I think.
There's sort of a visual relationship to the idea of prison bars as well, right? These shadows on the floor and these sort of vertical moments, and it all builds to this sense of incarceration, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Totally. Not the only way to use lines, for sure, but an effective way to quickly give you a sense of what this place looks like. If you're introducing the inside of this penitentiary or whatever it is, very quickly communicates to the audience what kind of space we're in. All right, our next element is shape. And so shape can be defined as just a 2D object in your frame, right? A line is like an outline or a straight or curved line, but a shape is actually like a filled object that gives you a sense of its shape. And these can be geometric, like a typical square, triangle, circle, etc. Or you can have organic shapes, which are like the outline of a person or the outline of whatever, but it's typically like, you can think of a silhouette as a good example, where you just kind of see the shape of something, but you have no sense of its depth, right? And these can provide scale for you. If an item repeats, it becomes a pattern, and then it's a good way to add interest. And often you'll see this used as like a positive or negative space, where you've got all black around a frame and you're focused on one thing, or it's the opposite, where you've got the remainder of the space that's left over, outlining a positive. So here's an image with a very strong shape in it. And so what does this do for us in this instance? Like, one, it makes it very interesting, right? It kind of gives us a frame around our image. It isolates?
From the rest of the
Yeah, totally. All right, here's a little technical info if you're interested. Here's another shape. What shape do we see in this one? An organic shape. So it could be, right, the organic shape is the outline of the person, right? But we don't, it's mostly silhouette. It's almost like two different shapes on top of each other, which is interesting. I think the triangle is particularly interesting, like from the light, because there's nothing actually like defining the edges of it. It's just a beam of light in space, right? So there's two different shapes for you. More camera info. Here's another one. These are interesting shapes. This one's got like some layers to it. Right, so in the foreground we've got this tree. We have no sense of depth of the tree, but it does tell us a lot. Like having no kind of detail in it almost highlights the shape of it in this case, right? Get a sense that it's this old weathered tree that's been dead for some time.
It's a beautiful use of atmospheric perspective too, where you can see the colors sort of muting and getting hazier and hazier as the further the image goes back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so there's a beautiful contrast there, exactly. Sort of draws your attention to it because it stands out so much differently.
Yeah. Right, and you've even contrast I think is a good word to use here. Contrast by definition being like the lightest points in your frame and the darkest points in your frame and the distance between them. But we literally have a representation of contrast here because the foreground of the frame is dark, black, right? And the top of the frame is, more or less is the lightest part of the image. And it's just kind of interesting to see it laid out this way where we kind of work our way almost like a gradient going from dark to light as well. But some strong lines in here as well. We've got the lines of the hills going across, forming shapes themselves. So, as we look at images, you're not looking at one element typically at a time. You're looking at a combination of elements kind of building on top of each other to build our composition. Some more technical info. How about this? What is this object? Shadow. It's a coffee mug, right? Which is kind of interesting because you're seeing like a circle with a rectangle attached to it. But the giveaway is this other shape down here, right? Which we know as humans is a shadow because the light is being cast across it. And so it's just interesting because we get the context from kind of the combination of the two shapes, but we're not actually seeing any of the 3D depth of the object itself. Right, so which brings us to form. Form is kind of like shape, but with another dimension. So, it's the coffee mug with some depth to it, right? We're probably moving the camera around it so that we can get a sense of what shape it is. And this is often done with like light and shadow because you'll see how light is cast across the surface of something and reveals kind of the form or the shape of it. So you can think of things that are good examples of form or like a sphere or a cube, something that has depth to it. And this can add dimensionality to your object or your frame. And it really kind of defines the physicality of an object. So there's the promised coffee mug, right? So instead of looking straight overhead, we've kind of moved alongside it. And this kind of gradient that comes across the image really helps you get a sense of what shape it is. And even the light kind of hitting back over here on the handle gives you a sense of just how rounded it is. And so no longer do we have just a typical two-dimensional circle and coffee cup shadow. We actually get the form of a coffee cup, and you can kind of imagine what it's like to pick it up in your hand. How about this? I love this image. It's beautiful. A simple piece of garlic, right? But look at all the detail in it, right? Look, you can see where each, I don't know, what is a garlic? Clove, yeah, where all the cloves kind of hug the body, right? You can really see the kind of waviness of it, and you get a sense of what it would be like to pick it up. And the paper on the outside has so much detail in it that, you get a real sense of it, right? And so this is mostly done by shooting close up in this case and having light that really exaggerates, or maybe not exaggerates is the wrong word, but enhances the shape of the image. Yeah, accentuates the shape of the image, right? But this is a good example of form. Some more technical info. Food, I love food, can I say? So this is a pepper doing the same kind of thing. And this is interesting because this is the only thing in the frame, right? It's just literally black behind it. And the gray on the sides are just for illustration purposes of where the frame itself ends, right? But you really get a sense of the texture almost. A good texture example, but a sense of texture of the image and kind of natural organic waviness of it. Same kind of thing, strawberry, right? You really just kind of want to bite into it because you can get a sense of just how like plump it is, and the color does a nice little touch to it as well. So that is form.
Question.
Yes.
The last two images, can you explain to me how they are not 2D? They seem like like
so it's kind of a flat image like you're saying,
Yeah.
but I would argue that it's the contours from the shadow
Okay.
that give you a sense of the shape of it, right? This is kind of flat. It's not, if we had moved the camera up a little bit and got more of an angle of the top, you would have maybe a better sense of the 3D. So we could certainly argue whether this is a good example or not.
I just didn't want to get them confused in my head because I was like, this looks almost 2D, but I can see the light and depth I see.
Yeah.
Very little, but I get it.
Totally. No, I picked it just because of you get the sense of the shape of it on the outside, but I totally take your point that, it feels a little bit less like a 3D image, and this almost feels like more like texture.
Can we go back to
It's also sort of the flat side of the pepper too, right?
Yeah.
So that it is sort of a plane that we're looking at, but that the curves come out at just sort of the edges and the undulations of the pepper skin.
Yeah.
Can we go to the coffee
garlic?
cup again?
The coffee cup?
Yeah, the 2D and the 3D, go back and forth.
Oh, I can't jump quite because there's a slide in between, but.
So like at first I was like, this looks kind of 3D to me because of the shadow.
Sure.
But then when you guys showed the 3D image, and I was like, I see it. Because go to the 3D image, because you can see this one shot from straight up top, so straight down. But then if you go to the 3D image, you'll see that this the circle top part of the cup is what gives it like the most strong, obvious.
This up here for you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was just flat from top. I said, what was going to be the difference? So when I saw this, I was like, wow. Okay.
Well, this one was meant to be a trick, right? Because if you look at it, your brain says, oh, this is a coffee cup. I know what it looks like because I've seen a million coffee cups, right? But really what you're looking at, I was trying to accentuate that you're looking at a circle, a little rectangle, and then the shape of a coffee cup, but it's all very flat, right? There's no depth to this image. It's flat shapes. And your brain is tricking you and saying there's depth to it because I know what a coffee cup looks like.
Exactly.
But in this one, you actually get the shape and the form of it put together. So you see how round it is from the top and from the light being cast across it. All right, moving ahead here. All right, pattern. So we talked about pattern a moment ago when we talked about a repetition of shape, but pattern is a really good way to get things to stand out as well. And this is kind of a common theme in making a strong image and having good composition is your subject, you kind of want to find a way to make it stand out somehow, or not, or the opposite. But typically, using tricks like pattern and strong lines and shape and texture are going to be the things that you're going to put together and build a frame that stands out and is strong, right? And so pattern can bring harmony and comfort, or it can do the opposite and give you, if you use irregular patterns, that can be kind of chaotic. So, but as I just said, it can also make contrasting elements stand out. So here's some pattern. All right, so we know as humans that this is a series of windows on a wall, right? But it's interesting because if you kind of distill it down, it's really a bunch of lines and rectangles. And so the things that stand out to me, at least, are these windows that are different, right? So down here we've got this white box, right? You might not notice immediately at first, right? And then you've got a couple of open windows as well. How about this? This is a beautiful image, right? It's very abstract. What is it, though? A fence, yeah, a chain link fence. But we're so close to it, and we've made it so kind of abstract. And we get a good sense of, like look at the kind of form of it, right? You can see the curve of the fence itself, the light being cast across it. You get a good sense of texture if you look at the kind of close-up rust on it. And you really get a good sense of what it is while having it be very abstract at the same time.
There's also a nice sort of rhythm to it, right? It's sort of just repetition of visual elements, sort of, I don't know, it's in some ways calming. And it also has this nice sort of like linear effect going up as well, with the size of the links getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Right, here's another idea of pattern and contrast. So, I mean, it's right in the middle of the image, but this definitely jumps out at you. I don't know if it's a drain or whatever it is, but you get this pattern with the one element that stands out because it's different. So very strong contrasting element in here. Some technical info. And then texture. This is the last of our elements that we're going to talk about. But this is literally what the surface of the image would feel like if you were to touch it, right? Exactly what it sounds like, texture, right? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it hard? Is it bumpy? Is it soft? So we describe visually how something looks or feels, and it is a good way to kind of convey almost like time, right? A sense of where is something new and shiny, is something old and kind of rotten, just like the fence we just looked at. Like what texture does it have to it? Like the rust clearly illustrates how long it's been sitting there. So here's some interesting texture, right? What are these?
Those are slot canyons in Utah and Arizona.
All right, slot canyons from Utah, Arizona. Thank you. Yes. I don't actually know if that's where they are, but beautiful. I love this because it's like the texture of the walls feels like a cross-section of time to me, right? You can imagine how many years it took for the water to kind of carve its way through here. And it really gives you a sense of just like what it would be like to run your hand kind of along the side of it. And you'll notice we've taken color away in this one too. What does that do for our texture? Desaturated.
Puts a lot more emphasis on the texture. The colors make it a very different image.
Exactly, right? So when we take away the color, it's one less thing for our brains to kind of focus on and get confused about, and it kind of emphasizes the other things.
Also contrast.
Yeah, and it also accentuates contrast. Exactly. How about this? What would this taste like to bite into? Or not taste like, what texture would it have if you bit into it? Again, I love food.
Flaky.
Flaky, crumbly, yeah, exactly. Right? You can imagine just from this little giveaway down here in particular, if you were to pick this up, just how it would kind of crumb apart in your hand, and how crispy, how much butter must actually be in it to make it crisp up like that. And we're so close on it, like almost what it is itself doesn't matter, but it's just this beautiful texture that's emphasized here. Some technical info. And what's this? It's a pretty flat image here too, right? Mm-hmm. We've got a bunch of just lines going across. Right? We've got our texture of our cross-section of time yet again, where the water is kind of eroded over time. And then this building is interesting because it's so flat. There's no, like the photographer decided to get very squared up to it, and there's no depth to it, right? This is just a rectangle with a series of smaller rectangles in it, and yet another rectangle for the roof.
There's also, it looks like it was shot in the middle of the day, so the shadows don't help with that feeling of depth at all.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? It was shot in the middle of the day. So the sun being our primary light source here was probably straight overhead, and there's very little shadow being cast, right? We've got a little bit because we can see the texture on the wall here, but it's definitely a pretty flat image, which is accentuated by the sun being almost straight overhead, right? If we had shot this at the end of the day or early in the morning, right, we get a lot more shadow being kind of creeping across, and it would feel quite different.
I think that's something to consider too when you think about how to accentuate texture in photography. Is this stucco wall is sort of a good example that when the light is sort of raking along the side of a flat plane or something, you'll see the shadow of the texture of it. Mm-hmm. And so waiting for the right moment to take a picture of something or lighting it in a way to sort of bring out that texture can really help accentuate these kinds of ideas.
Oh, color. Totally forgot about color, right? So we're not going to dwell on color too much in this class. Q being the color itself, value being how light or dark it is, the intensity being the level of saturation. So if something is either not saturated at all, it's black and white, or if it's fully saturated, it's got all the color in it. You can use color to convey emotions or enhance the mood or feeling of an image. But what we're going to focus on in this class is kind of 3 different elements of color, whether an image is warm, neutral, or cool, are the 3 elements we're going to use. So warm being on the orange side of things, like warm, inviting, kind of what you might expect. and cool being on literally the cold end of the spectrum where we have a lot more blues, and neutral somewhere in between where, when you calibrate your camera to your light source, neutral is white or gray or doesn't have a cast either way, either orange or blue. All right, so we'll talk about color temperature for that. This is a very easy thing to change on your camera, and we'll look at the menu in a second. This is roughly the options you get. So auto white balance being let your camera decide for you, or you can be intentional and choose something. So we have full sun, shadow, cloudy, overhead tungsten light, like an old school light bulb, fluorescent light, flash, which is the actual color temperature of a flash. This is a custom mode right here, which is a pain in the butt to set in most cameras. And then the Kelvin value, which is where you actually pick a specific white point to set your camera to. And we say Kelvin scale, it's this, right? So we've got the warm end of the spectrum and the cool end of the spectrum, and we describe this in terms of Kelvin, and how how that scale stacks up is something like a match or a candle. It's going to be extremely orange or red as far as its wavelength that the light bouncing off it emits, and all the way up towards cool is a bright blue daylight at 10,000. And so when you look at the presets on your camera, the two typical ones that you might use are going to be that tungsten or halogen bulb, which is at 3200K. And you don't need to know this number, but we'll show you why it's handy. And then the other one you might typically see is up here in this area. It's 5600K, which is your typical daylight, and that's what the sun icon is going to be. So the little light bulb icon in your preset white balances is going to be right here at 3200K, and your daylight is going to be 5600K. And that will calibrate your camera, right? So if you want to go out in the middle of the day and shoot something and you want it to be a neutral image, you don't want it to have a warm cast or a cool cast, you might set your calibration of your white balance to somewhere right up here in the 5600K. You might choose that sun icon. And if you want to go out at sunrise or sunset and you want to have it be neutral, again, you might go out to shoot the sunset, you might want it to be warm, right? But if you want it to be more neutral, you would choose a lower end of the spectrum here, such as the 3200K. And often, if you want a neutral image, you just go look at the light sources that are around you. If you're inside and there's a bunch of light bulbs in the ceiling, you're probably going to want to choose something like this. And if you're outside in the daylight, you're going to want to choose somewhere up here on the spectrum to make a neutral image.
So I think the important thing to sort of distill out of this is that every light source that you come across emits light at a specific color temperature, somewhere on this scale. And you can calibrate your camera to match that color temperature, and if you do, the light will look neutral. And if you don't, it will look either warm or cool, depending on how you calibrate your camera in relationship to that. But do understand that different light sources have different color temperatures, and we can match cameras to those color temperatures, or we can not match them. And how we decide to not match them will define whether it looks warm or cool.
And which we can use to effect.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So again, you don't need to know these numbers, but just know the lower the number, the warmer end of the spectrum we're going to be on, and the higher the color, or the higher the number, the cooler the calibration of your camera is going to be. And the effect of that is, if you set your camera up here as neutral point, everything's actually going to be up here warmer because you're kind of looking back down the spectrum. You can think of it that way. And so if you're down here and you set your camera here, everything's going to kind of appear more blue because you're kind of looking back up the spectrum. Does that make sense? We're going to actually do an example of this, so it'll hopefully make more sense. But it's helpful to, as you look at this chart, to know that if you set your calibration down here, you're kind of looking up the spectrum, and if you set it up there, you're looking back. Oh, and if you're shooting photos and you're shooting in RAW mode, this doesn't matter as much because this is something you can change. We're not going to do too much RAW photography in this class. We're going to go ahead and shoot JPEG. So RAW photos, you can change this later. And if you're shooting JPEG or video, for the most part, it's baked in, so you can't change this once you shoot it. So it's very important if you're taking a JPEG photo or shooting video to get this right as you shoot it. All right, so we're getting a little sleepy here. We're going to put Ian up on the spot.
Oh, it's my
I'm going to
big
put Max on the spot here as our videographer on camera here. So let's go ahead and put this camera up on the screen. So here is Ian, and we're here in the cinema, and maybe you've noticed if you come here in person, like what characteristic is the light here? what color is it? Like to your human eyes, right? Our eyes are very versatile, right? We don't typically see white as different colors. If we're inside and seeing tungsten light or outside and seeing sunlight, it all just kind of looks natural to us, right? But when you see in contrast, like so on the sides of the theater here, we have some warmer light, right? Yeah, some tungsten light. Did you notice? Like I noticed this when we put the lights in. Like it's super blue. It's very cool light, right? And it looks neutral because we have calibrated the cameras to match. And the reason that we've actually done this in this class is because the white point of the TV that we're working with is 6500K or Kelvin. And the reason we want, when you see us and when you see the image, the cameras don't have this kind of range that our eyes have. So it sees one color or another. So if we had set everything to kind of the tungsten value or the warmer light, the screen would appear incredibly blue. So what we've done is we've calibrated the light and the cameras to match the screen. I'm losing everybody. Yeah. That was kind of a fun aside. All right, so let's make this more real. So I brought this light panel here with us, and I'm going to ask the control room to dim the lights here in a second, or now. And I'm going to turn this light on. And so here we go. Here is Ian. We'll get the camera all focused up. And Ian, is he warm, neutral, or cool?
Cool.
Cool? Okay. And so what does that mean as far as how our camera is calibrated? Like, so this light is probably calibrated around 6,000 Kelvin right now. So if Ian is appearing cool, is the Kelvin value of the camera lower or higher?
Lower.
It's calibrated lower, right? Because we're looking back up the spectrum.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, the light, let's see. Does it actually have a number on it?
It does.
Hold on, I got to look at it. Oh, no, it's just got a level. It's all the way to daylight. So, all right, here's Ian. I'm going to now turn the light color towards our tungsten light, or the warmer end of that spectrum, and we can watch it change in real time. Right, our cameras are fixed. Right, so Ian feels very different right now. Right, this is warm, neutral, or cool? Warm, right?
Yeah,
very warm.
It's very
warm. Warm by comparison. All right, but we can affect this ourselves if we want to make our image warm, neutral, or cool by changing the camera. So Max, as our camera operator here, what is your camera set to right now?
It's 5,600.
All right, so it's 5600K, right? The same kind of preset for daylight, because that's the color of the light that we had in here. Why don't you go ahead and set that to 3200K, or the tungsten value, and we'll watch this change live. So Max is adjusting the camera. He's kind of scrolling. Max, hit the advanced button and actually dial it in. It's more dramatic when it jumps.
Okay. 300.
3200,
okay,
3200. Right? And there we go. And so now this warm light has turned what? Warm, neutral, or cool?
Cool.
Cool, right?
It's cool. But the light hasn't changed, right? Nothing has changed about this light. We haven't changed a dial or a setting on it, but we did change the camera settings.
Yeah. And so now, if I turn this back up to daylight, right? Have you ever seen an image that's like on the wrong white balance setting?
Yes.
Right? This kind of looks like that, right? It's very, very cool.
This is very sad.
Yeah.
Movie blue.
But this could be used to effect, right? Like, what kind of emotion does this give you? Ignore Ian's face. Like, the cool cast alone connotes what?
Sadness.
Sadness, yeah. Fear, I mean...
Vice media.
Say it a little louder.
Like when I'm watching a Vice documentary.
A Vice documentary, okay. So you're manipulating your audience though, right? You want them to feel a certain way. You can do that by casting light. And so, or by casting by calibrating your camera in a certain way so that the color of the light is a certain color. So let's do this somewhere in between now just to prove that I'm not lying to you. I'm gonna set it right in the middle. So let's call that about 4,500. Mm-hmm. All right. So this light source is now in the middle, and if I don't touch the light, but I ask Max to turn his calibration to, let's say, 10,000, what's that going to do for us?
10,000K.
Yeah, dial it in and don't hit it yet.
What
should make him very warm.
Okay.
Very warm. Okay, let's hit it, Max.
Oh boy.
Bang. Very warm, right? For a light source that's somewhere in the middle of its range, and at the other end of the spectrum, how low can you go? I think it's like 1900. on that camera. Bang, we get a cool light source. Right, so it's really interesting how you can do this, right? All right, we can bring the lights back up, I think. Thank you, Ian. We'll go back over to the slides here. All right, that was warm and cool with Ian. Thank you.
So then,
yes.
What you were saying earlier, if we were shooting in RAW, none of this would matter because we would be able to change it from warm to cool.
Exactly.
How we want, but if we shooting in JPEG and then we got the cool, we wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're more technical and you're shooting your camera mode in actual RAW capture, there's a setting in your menu that says RAW. And there's also a setting for your JPEG capture. Usually you can capture both, but you might choose one or the other.
Can you describe just what RAW is?
Yeah.
Just sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah. So if you're shooting RAW, what you're doing is your sensor is getting all the light sent into it, and if you're shooting JPEG, it makes a decision and kind of formulates an image out of it. If you're shooting RAW, your sensor takes all of that data and just kind of stores it. Think of it as like a big blob that you can later figure out what you want it to look like and form it into a JPEG at another point in time. The way I like to think about it is that when you're looking at raw data, you don't actually see the raw image, but you see a JPEG representation of it. So if you're looking in Lightroom, you're getting a representation at any given moment of what the raw data looks like. It's almost like a window into that raw data. And as you move the sliders around, one of the sliders that you can move is color temperature. And so you can make the image warm or cool, or warmer or cooler in Lightroom if you're shooting RAW. That's something you get for free if you're shooting in the RAW format. But if you're shooting JPEG, this is something you can modify.
Not for free.
What's the trade-off?
The trade-off is size, right?
Okay, fair. So there's always a trade-off. There's no free lunch. Thank you, Ian. Right? So with RAW, you're storing a lot more data because you're not throwing anything away. You're saving all of those bits that comprise your image, and then later you can make that decision of what color temperature you want it to be. In this day and age, when we have so much space available, maybe it's a really minor trade-off to make. But back in the day, when you had to pay a lot of money for every gigabyte on your memory card, this was a much bigger deal. Question?
And when Max is making these adjustments, what is the camera doing physically? Just changing some baseline value that all
it's the process in the sensor that actually decides what to show you the image as, because the sensor is seeing just light values bouncing into it. And so when you see a representation of it, you're setting the camera to say, okay, I want to have the sensitivity of the brightness be set here. I want the white point of the camera to be set here with my white balance. And so the camera is you're making those decisions when you set the camera technically.
Basically, the color white, the tone of the color white is predetermined, basically. This influences the rest.
I would describe it as the neutral point of your camera, right? So you determine what is neutrals, and which means like if you're looking at a white element, the element will appear white versus having a warm or a cool cast to it. So when you set the color temperature or white balance on your camera, you're deciding what is white for all intents and purposes. And then the camera will shift everything else based on that.
And I think that's a bit of why it can be confusing sometimes, because in conventionally we talk about it as white balance, but really what we're talking about is an image. If you focused on an image with no color in it, it would have no color in it, right? And so you imagine like a gray card or a neutral subject that when you photographed it, it would have no color cast at all to it, okay? But because a neutral object is reflecting light, if that light has a color cast that strikes a neutral object, right, the neutral object will reflect some aspect of that color, okay? So what we're doing with the cameras is saying, okay, the light has this color, please subtract this color from the image so that this neutral item looks neutral, okay? And so you can sort of manipulate the camera controls to have it add or subtract sort of different elements of color to the light that's coming back.
Yeah. And actually, I meant to take a moment here and actually pull up a camera example. So Max, 1, if you didn't set your white balance back, please set it back to 5600. And then 2, if you can give me a close-up shot on this camera, I just want to show, actually we can probably do it with the screen here. Just push a button down here. Turn this on. So if you're like, this is great, you're talking about changing the white balance of my camera, but where do we actually do that? let me show you. All right, so this is a Canon camera. You know, other brands will vary slightly, but on a Canon camera, in the red shooting menu, you can come down here. I press the menu button to get here, and then you can choose white balance. And right now, I'm preset to that Kelvin value. And what the icons are telling us is that the knob is this top knob here, and as I turn that, I'm going to adjust that Kelvin value, right? So if I wanted to lower my Kelvin value, I just dial it down. I can go to 3200. I can go lower, but if I set it to 3200, this is now the same as that light bulb preset, right? Or I can dial it up back to 5600, and this is the same as the sun preset. But the beauty of understanding the numbers on the Kelvin scale are that you can go somewhere in between, right? And if you're not sure what it's going to do, simply push this button, look down, look at your screen and watch what happens to your image. Does it get warmer or does it get cooler, right? You don't have to understand exactly which way you're going to go to just turn the knob and see it, right? You'll see, am I getting a warmer cast or am I getting a cooler cast?
I'm curious, does this, I guess, list of white balances that we have available with these presets from the sun all the way to the flash, is that in warmest to coolest?
No, it's not, because the warmest one is going to be the light bulb. So I don't know why it's in this order. It does seem silly that it wouldn't be from warm to cool, but the menu we are looking at is not not set that way. So maybe you should go into camera design, because that would be very smart.
Yeah.
But if we now, let me actually put this into live view mode, and we can see, if all goes well, there's the side of the stage. And so we can see that I'm still preset in my white balance. I'm going to push the button here. And as I dial this around, I can't actually change the Kelvin value on this camera in live view, but I can change, hopefully, there's auto, daylight. So if you can see this, hopefully nice and close up, we've got the daylight. We press it again, it keeps timing out. There's shade, pretty close. Cloudy. I don't know the exact values for these things, so it's up to you if you want to use them. Just look down at your screen and make the decision. Right? But this one's going to feel quite a bit cooler, right? Because this is that 3200K value because we're on the tungsten light bulb, right? Fluorescent is going to be somewhere in between. Flash is going to make everything quite warm because flash, I think, is around, what, 10,000 K?
Yeah, I think. Depends.
Yeah. But really, the two, if I can say, like, there are two that you should understand. It's the daylight. Wow, this is wacky. It's the, oh, man. It's the light bulb. Ian, can you point for me?
Yes.
Okay. It's the light bulb, which is 3200K, and it's the sun, which is 5600K, right? And then you can turn it into the Kelvin mode, which is literally that K. You can click this, and you can choose what to set it to if you want to be more advanced. But simply jumping between those two presets should be able to give you warm or cool.
Right. And so your camera that you have may not allow you to set the individual Kelvin values. Maybe it only has presets. Or maybe it only has sort of an auto white balance functionality. And if that's true, then knowing the presets, which ones to use, whether the one for daylight or one for tungsten will be really helpful. And if you have to use an auto white balancing feature, then focusing on a neutral subject, a chroma neutral subject, or at worst case scenario, a white subject that you want to be neutral, that's being hit by the light in your scene, is a good way to do that. Okay, but ultimately, being able to set the Kelvin value incrementally is incredibly helpful to control exactly how your images are going to look.
Is the change to the let's say the digital file of the image the same whether you do it in camera with a cleverly chosen preset basically and the manipulation in Lightroom?
Well, it depends on the mode you shoot in. If you are, say, shooting in RAW, then you have the ability to make changes later in Lightroom. Yeah. So maybe
which would be the same as doing it in camera.
Which, yes.
There's no trade-off there.
But at the cost of having to save a lot of data, that you save all this raw data and then you sort of decide how it's going to look later. Whereas, again, when we're talking about trade-offs, when you have a camera and you shoot in JPEG mode, you decide in the moment how it will look. But that's sort of it. It's baked in, and trying to remove that color cast usually degrades the image in a way that it's sort of no longer usable, or unacceptable for most situations.
Yeah, and I will say, like, software is getting much better at this. Like, the first time I did a demo of editing in Lightroom, and I used a JPEG, like, it kind of tore apart. The color didn't look good. But I did it, I think, last year or the year before, and it was a pretty phenomenal, like, how good of a job the algorithms are getting that make this change for you. So it's not to say that there's no flexibility if you edit your JPEG photos in something like Lightroom or other software, but you definitely have the most flexibility if you're actually shooting in RAW.
But I guess it's a much more conscious decision when you shoot the picture at that moment.
Yeah. And like, that's like, if you're comfortable, that's what we want to emphasize in this class, is like, this is how you always used to have to do it, right? You didn't have this magic ability to change the sensor data or the piece of film, you know, back in
you
the,
loaded
in the
film
old
and
days.
that was it. You had 36 pictures at a specific ISO and a specific color temperature, right? Film was daylight or tungsten, and that was it, right? And then you chose an ISO, and that was it.
Yeah.
And you could change, you know, film canisters and things like that, but you'd have to run out your camera and take all 36 pictures.
Yeah. So we're lucky to have RAW at our fingertips, but I think it's really important as we start to grow as photographers to kind of understand the ability to change this frame, and the assignment around this will help with that, because it's something you can play with, is adding a warm or a cool cast to it. All right, so we're running out of time quickly here, so we'll start to move a little bit more quickly. As a recap, daylight is set to what Kelvin value? 5600, exactly. What is this image, warm, neutral, or cool?
Cool.
Right, and why? Right, we know it's a blue sky regardless, because we're humans and have seen sky, but what is it that tells you that this is cool?
Everything's blue.
Everything's blue. And specifically, I think it's really handy if you're unsure of like what color cast it has, look at the white elements or the lighter elements in it. And if you literally have a tool, like a digital color meter tool that's built into Macs and PCs, you can hover over the cool element or the highlight elements of your frame and see, does it come up as blue, or does it come up as orange, or does it come up as a white? And that'll help you determine if you're looking at a warm, a neutral, or a cool image. All right, and so what was the camera set to for this cool image?
Warm.
Warm, right? 3200K. It was, or the equivalent of the tungsten light bulb. Okay, how about this? Same image. I used Lightroom to modify this, so it's the same image.
Good.
You get color for free. But I exported JPEGs, which we're looking at now. Warm, neutral, or cool?
Neutral.
Pretty neutral, right? Okay, so the daylight is 5600K. What was the camera set to?
4,000.
I'm sorry?
4,000.
4,000 is actually the same, right? Because the image is neutral, right? I've set the calibration of my camera. I've calibrated it to the same thing as my light source. My light source, I know, is 5600K. So to get a neutral image, I've set my camera to the exact same thing. And this is the opposite, warm cast, right? So if daylight is 5600K, what was the camera set to? Something higher, right? 10,000. You got it, Ralph. And so that gives us this warm effect. And so this is something you really need to think about if you're shooting in JPEG and need to capture it in the moment, because you don't have much wiggle room later. If you're shooting in RAW, the trade-off is space, right? But then you can make this decision later. All right, so you can use these two effects. We talked about, you know, what kind of emotions a warm cast or a cool cast will give you. And I came across this image on the T back in 2017, and this is like a really to use Ian's term, ham-fisted approach to using color. Right, so what we've got is like a mother presumably kissing the boo-boo of her daughter, and or a nurse maybe. And inside where the kiss is happening, it's this warm glow, and on the outside we've got this kind of blue fall off, like she's kissing the boo-boo away. So just one way that you can kind of use this. But I thought this was kind of a silly, heavy-handed example that is a good example of how it can be used to effect, even if too strongly. So bringing things back to composition, there's a bunch of other elements of composition that you should take into account, which we're going to kind of move through quickly when you're building your frame. Right? We talked about those classic kind of design elements, but there's a whole lot more that goes into building a frame. And the three things I think that are the most important that we'll talk about in the remainder of our time are perspective, balance, and contrast. So perspective is literally where is the camera placed? Is it on the level as our subject? Is it below our subject? Or is it above our subject, right? They all feel different, but you need to make a choice when you place the camera, because you have to put it somewhere. So, and if you get high enough, you start to get even more interesting things that happen, potentially. They can happen normally if you're at eye height. But I guess with perspective too, where are most images taken that you see? Like at what height? Eye height, right? Most people take their camera out, they either do this and click on their phone, or they put it up to their eye and then click like this, right? When you see images like that, they feel a bit more like, to use the catchphrase, pedestrian, right? It's just very kind of, pedestrian, right? But if you change that, like if you as a photographer take a knee and get low, or climb up on something, a ladder or a stool, or even higher, and get something, it's just like, it makes your frame more interesting because it's an angle that we don't typically see when we're looking at images, right? And especially if there's some interesting paint on the ground, it gets really interesting. Some technical info. How about this one? Right, this one's a trick. The image actually looks like this, right? Which is kind of fascinating. All the photographer did was the houses presumably are straight because you don't want to live in a house that's crooked. But simply by turning the camera and leveling with the street and this truck that was pointed uphill, right, this turns into a really interesting image. All right, so an easy way to make your photo more interesting, change your perspective. Simple as that. If you're taking out your phone and you're doing this, think for one more second, either go higher or go lower, and just see what it looks like. Maybe this is the right height to do it at, but consider the alternatives. Balance. So literally everything in your frame is going to have kind of a weight to it. And is the right side of your frame and the left side of your frame weighted the same, right? So in this photo from Wes Anderson, who shoots everything kind of very straight on and in a balanced way, there's a whole bunch more images over here. There's fewer over here, but we've got this one bigger element up top to kind of balance it out. And it's just this idea of an equal weight to your, or a non-equal weight to your frame, right? This can show itself in symmetry. So here's an image that's very symmetrical. And so this image is very well balanced because both sides of the frame are basically the same thing. Whereas a frame that is unbalanced might feel very different. And this feels very comfortable, very easy to look at. I don't have an unbalanced frame next. I should have. I'm sorry. But an unbalanced frame can make you feel much more uncomfortable. So in balance of your frame, one thing we want to consider when shooting human subjects is the headroom, which is literally like how much space is there from the top of the head to the top of the frame? Or is there a lot? Is there a little? We can use this to effect. So in this image, the subject is cut off, right? Which might be a little bit disjointing for us or make us feel more uncomfortable, right? And when used in combination with everything else, right? This is a fairly wide angle lens, and we get a little bit of exaggeration. His nose looks pretty big compared to the rest of his face. With the headroom cut off, no headroom up here, it just feels a bit more uncomfortable. And so this is used to effect. Here's a couple frames. On the left, a frame from Mission Impossible. We've got Alec Baldwin, feeling kind of, important, for lack of a better term. And on the right, from The King's Speech, we have Colin Firth here. How does he feel? Lost, right? What makes you say that? Is it like...
Because he's hanging on the bottom of the screen.
He's hanging at the bottom. He has a ton of headroom, right? So it's a very unbalanced frame in that sense. Whereas Alec Baldwin, like the camera angle's right at his height, right? Or just slightly below him even, right? Kind of looking up at him, giving him some power. And there's a correct amount of space on the side of the frame. He's got the right amount of space over his head. So it's a very strong, confident character right there, where right on the flip side, much less so. So nose room or lead room is the idea that the gaze of the person from where they're looking should in fact affect where they sit in the frame. Are they center? Are they to the side? Right. So this character is looking completely profile to the camera, so they're weighted all the way to the side of the frame, and that just feels more comfortable for us as viewers because it's the convention that we're used to seeing. So what happens when we change this? Well, hold that thought. When the character is looking center, right, we tend to center them up, right? And again, it's just for a good balance to the frame. And whereas if they're looking slightly to the side, they're typically put slightly on the side of the frame. So she's weighted slightly left here, but she's weighted slightly right here, but she's looking to the left, right? So we're just kind of balancing out the frame. So the more extreme your subject is looking, typically, and this is very relevant in video in particular, the more you might weight them to the side of the frame. So all the way profile, you might push them all the way to the side of your frame. And if they're looking at the camera, you might want to center them up. Does this make sense? All right, sorry we're moving quickly. I want to get through all this. So nose room or lead room, right? So again, conversation between two people. We have appropriate, nose room here on Leo in The Wolf of Wall Street, confident character. But same thing when we look back at the King's Speech. This character's kind of looking off to the side, and there's very little nose room or look room for him. Right? We've got all this extra space over here, which is a bit more uncomfortable for us as viewers because it's not the convention we're used to seeing. Right? How about the color cast of this image while we're here? Warm, neutral, or cool? Cool, right? Look at those white elements, the highlights. They're all kind of blue. Look at the side of his face. It's got a blue cast to it, right? Feels kind of sad, uncomfortable more. All right, just a few guidelines for you as you're starting to build your frames. The rule of thirds. Anybody know offhand the definition for the rule of thirds? All right, I'll spoil it because we're running out of time. If you broke your frame up, that this white box was your frame, and you broke it up with these lines to make the image into thirds, you should have your action kind of fall along these lines. And where the lines meet at these kind of nodal points is where you want to put your strongest action, right? And so what that's going to do is give you balance, because if you're putting something on one of these thirds, it's going to kind of balance. I guess that's not true, right? It depends on where you place all the elements in your frame. Let's look at some examples. This will make it even better. So we have some sheep here, and if we look at the rule of thirds, here we break up our image, right? This vertical sign basically falls on the third, and the sheep kind of fall on this third over here. And our horizon line, even one of the edges falls on the third. And the result of that, I think, is that it's a pretty strong image, right? It's got a pretty clear subject. It's got a little bit of foreground element. In this case, our subject really is kind of at the edge of the foreground, start of the middle ground, right? We've got more space behind it, and then the background way in the back, right? Another image that uses good use of thirds. I don't have the grid to overlay on this, but what's interesting about the decision made here is that our subjects are kind of on the top third of this one, right? But it still feels comfortable to look at. It's not uncomfortable.
Well, I think, too, if you look at the past two images, the horizon line actually falls on one of the third lines and not directly bisecting the image, right? And I think that that's something that maybe people often do when they just sort of pull up a phone and snapshot something. The horizon line sort of just bisects the middle of the image, and you can use it to great effect if you shift it up or shift it down, just as a sort of just a natural, helpful element to create some difference in weight between the two edges of the frame. Sections.
All right, some technical info for that one. And just a note, as you're going about framing an image, look at the edges of your frame right before you press the shutter, because you'll find something you might notice like this, right? What stands out in this image?
She has a pole standing out of her head.
Yeah, she's got a pole sticking out of her head, right? And that kind of is silly. It kind of ruins the image. If you had spent all this time kind of composing this shot, and then you get back later and realize that, oh man, something was sticking out, or there's like, somebody in the background like staring deadpan into the camera, right? You kind of wish you had caught that in the moment. And with digital tools, you can certainly manipulate all of this, but give your edges of your frame a scan right before you push the shutter, because it'll help you catch little things like that could otherwise trip you up. Some technical info. Here's another one, a couple of examples, right? So the one on the left is presumably done street photography style, where the camera was just kind of held and placed and snapped and cut off the head. But this one on the right, like if somebody had spent this time kind of building this frame of this church and all of a sudden cut out the very top of it, it feels like a mistake to us as an audience looking at this image. And a simple scan of the edge of the frame would have allowed us to catch that, right? Instead of getting back and be like, oh, I should have just tilted my camera up a little bit more. Just to hammer home the point of contrast, like contrast is a really strong way to make your image strong. Like making the subject pop is really easy to do when you use contrast, whether that's pattern, where you have a repetition with the one that stands out that's different, or whether it's color, where you've got all muted color around this bright color, or whether it's depth of field, where your subject is in sharp focus and everything else is in soft focus, right? These are all contrasting elements that we're choosing to make a strong focal point for our subject. Same thing here, right? This is literally like, if we think of contrast as the whitest parts of our frame and the darkest parts of our frame, and the range in between is the contrast of our image, right? This mirrors that beautifully, where we have like the darkest parts of our image right up against the lightest parts of our image. And the silhouette here is a reflection of that and makes it for a strong frame, in addition to just all of the other compositional elements in this. We've got lines, we've got shape, pattern, some technical info. So as you're building your frame, you want to figure out what is your focal point going to be, right? Where do you want to put your subject, and how do you want to make them stand out? And so the ways to kind of put your frame together to achieve this are to follow the rules of thirds, or break it, like if you're more comfortable. But if you're uncomfortable as a photographer and it's one of your first times going out to shoot and actually building the image, right, more than the just here's the image, here's the snapshot I took, if you're actually going to compose your frame, right, the rule of thirds is a fine place to start. Use lines, use brightness, use depth of field, and use negative space, and all of the design elements that we've talked about in this lecture to kind of put the frame together and really draw attention to your subject. Right, depth of field we're going to talk more on next time when we get to actual exposure. We're going to show you how to control your camera and control depth of field. Compositional triangles. So another just quick takeaway, right, is that there's a hidden triangle in this image which shows you exactly what the most important point in the frame is. Right, there's the triangle, right, and so this we can imagine is like an arrow that draws your attention right to the most important part of the frame. Right, again, this is just a guideline that you can use if you're trying to figure out how to compose your image. It's not a hard and fast rule, but the more you kind of look around, the more you'll see these. So in The Princess Bride, right, they're walking through a murky swamp, and there's this very deep cut which kind of draws your attention right to the location we're walking through, and how it must be awful to walk on this like muddy, straggly mess. Right? And there's no question who the most important person in this frame is from the same movie, right? All eyes right up to the crown. And that's more than just this triangle, but there's this definitive hierarchy that's been set up for us. Who is the most important person in the frame, just because not only is he taller than everybody else, but we've got like one of the lightest parts on the crown up there to draw your attention to as well. All right, so it all comes down to this question, I think. What is it that you want to say about your subject? We talked about this when we were doing storytelling in our first lecture, but when you know whose story it is and what story you're trying to tell, that's when you take all of these compositional elements and you put them together in a way that says, Ian is my villain, I want to vilify him, I'm going to give him some cold light, some shadow, I'm going to shoot a high angle on him and make it look very sinister, right? Or, Ian is my hero, I'm going to give him some nice flattering light. I'm going to shoot him on a long lens, and I'm going to,
make me look handsome.
Yeah, make him look handsome. So, it's all about taking these elements and putting them together and to really be intentional about the frame that you're building. So we are just a couple minutes over time here, so I'm going to end the formal lecture here, but say thank you for joining us, and we'll talk more about this kind of stuff next week.
Next week or the week after?
Next time.
Next time. Let's do that.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you all, folks. We'll see you next time.